Good evening. Right now, Metro Police are desperately searching for the person or people responsible for killing a man and a woman.
And I got a male down in the middle of the street.
Breaking news now, a triple shooting leaves 2 dead.
Never expect for somebody to tell you your loved one was murdered.
This Labor Day will mark 42 years that have haunted the St. Cloud family.
30 years. 30 years this family has waited for answers.
A couple months go by, 3, 4, 5, 6, and you really start to struggle with the idea that the case might not get solved and that somebody might get away with murder.
It's very unfortunate that we have any cold cases at all, and certainly unfortunate that we have as many as we do. And that's why Ryan's work and the work of Project Cold Case is so important.
All right. Hey, thanks for joining us this evening. We're back with our Facebook Live series. Joining me tonight is retired homicide sergeant, cold case sergeant Dan Janson.
Hello.
Thanks for joining me, Dan.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's good to see you, Ryan.
Yeah, this is great. So probably not the best night to be doing this, but we didn't have control of what was going on in DC. Hopefully everybody is safe up there and no injuries. But we're still going to go forward with our survivor workshop is what we're calling these. And this is a little bit of a tease for future where we're going to have more in-depth conversations with individuals like Dan, prosecutors, victim advocates, people that we feel like can help educate the public, answer questions, and help us through our journey of grief and a cold case. So we'll do those. We'll set those up later in the year where you'll actually register and be able to log in and watch via Zoom and interact and participate. For tonight, we're going to talk about some investigative techniques, a timeline. We're going to get into some details about some cases. And we ask that if you have questions, please post those in the comments. We have Clint from our office curating those comments, and he will present those to Dan and I towards the end of the presentation, and we'll try to answer ones we can. Please remember that we're not getting into case-specific questions, so Dan's not going to be able to answer, about your loved one specifically, but he may be able to shed some light on why an investigation took a turn one way or the other, or what some of the thought process may have been with those investigators. So I think it's going to be a great opportunity to hear live, no offense, Dan, but from the horse's mouth, how this process works, and hopefully shed some light on that and maybe answer some questions and hopefully even bring a little bit of understanding and peace to some of our survivors out there that really do either not know how the process works or need to know more, want to know more. So Dan, why don't you give us a brief, I'm introduced you as retired. That's pretty recent, just in the last couple of months. So why don't you give us a brief background on you?
Yeah, so I worked with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office for 28 years and 2 months. The backside of that career being mostly in homicide, cold case, and missing persons. And so I got a nice, good cross-section of how homicides are investigated, how they turn into cold cases, and how missing persons kind of plays into that as well. And they all do kind of interact. And the unfortunate thing is we have only 1 hour, but we could spend a week, 8 hours a day talking about the details of how an investigation begins from the onset of a homicide or a murder all the way to the conclusion, even if it's a cold case many years later. It's pretty involved, pretty in depth, and we can talk and extrapolate it out again for a very long time. So I worked in there for 28 years and 2 months. I retired October 2nd of this year, 2020. So I'm recently retired, enjoying realizing that every day is Saturday for me. So, but it's still all right there on the forefront of my mind because I've worked so much, and I'm sure I have some subpoena. I know I do because I got a phone call a couple days ago about a subpoena that I may have coming down the pipe on a previous case.
Yeah, well, congratulations on retirement.
Thank you.
Well deserved. To kind of let our viewers know how our paths even crossed is an interesting story in and of itself. I mean, we could literally spend an hour talking about that. Most people that follow our page know that I'm Ryan Backman, that I founded this organization, that I founded it because in 2009, my dad was murdered, and his case remains unsolved. So if we go back to 2009, you were the homicide sergeant of the team that was on call when my dad was murdered.
That's correct. Yep. So yeah, I remember it. I remember the fall day. I remember it was a nice day. Actually, the temperature was nice. It was sunny. We get called out there and we responded to the scene and began the investigation at that point. And little did I know that, 6 years later that you and I would cross paths again in a different way. And actually, I don't know that at the initial investigation, you and I ever crossed paths to begin with. Obviously I was familiar with your name, but
yeah, it's kind of one of those things, at least for me, that was like, I met people. I had two homicide detectives come to my door to make notification, but they weren't even the lead. That wasn't the lead detective and his partner at the time because they were down at my dad's house,
right.
At the time. So I met these two detectives that came to the door. Then later we had a press conference for a reward enhancement, and we went in and met with detectives at the police memorial building. So I met a lot of people that at that time were all just cops. They were all just police officers and detectives. I didn't know anything about investigations. I didn't know anything about law enforcement except, to try not to get pulled over for speeding and, to look out for the cars with the lights on top of them. I really had never, being a police officer wasn't something that I dreamed about doing. So I didn't go down that path in my career. I was in architecture, just doing my thing when my dad was murdered. So we may or may not have met back then, but we didn't develop a relationship back then regardless. It was years later when I had started Project Cold Case, and there was a lieutenant in the homicide department that was homicide unit that believed in what Project Cold Case was doing, felt like we were an asset to the community and to law enforcement. And we had a meeting, the three of us,
Yeah. So funny was that meeting was right on the onset of me transitioning from what was considered internally as a hot homicide team versus a cold case team. So I was transitioning into cold case at the time, and one of the agendas handed to me was, hey, make contact with this gentleman, Ryan Backman. He's got a nonprofit and we need to be part of his organization. Or see what he has to say. And I knew the Backman name was familiar to myself, but you don't always associate a name to a case that connection's going to be there. And that was the first question out of my mouth to that lieutenant was, is this in reference to Clifford Backman, or do you know? And he said it was. And so I said, okay, I'll call him up and, we'll meet together for lunch, or I'll get him on the calendar and we'll see what happens. And here we are, how many years later, so.
Yeah. Now, for those watching, Dan is a member of our board of directors. He's been an integral part of Project Cold Case since that meeting. Because, and this, I'll never forget this, is us talking for that first time, and you had gone on the Project Cold Case website, and you must have read every page that was on there, because you were throwing things at me that I was like, I'm not used to people really like diving in, and you know what I mean? They think they know what the organization is. They think they know what it does, but they don't always spend a lot of time actually looking into it. A lot of times there's a lot of misunderstanding that we are investigating a case, and obviously you didn't have that misunderstanding because you read the website. But I remember leaving that meeting and going, all right, like this guy, I didn't have to explain everything. If I started something, well, we like to do this. You say, oh, I saw that on your website. You know what I mean? Or you say, I also saw on your website where you did this, or you said that. So the meeting really started what has turned into, a friendship and then also we had this professional relationship where you were a true ally for Project Cold Case within law enforcement, and then even now, as a retired law enforcement. And that was never lost on us, that we had somebody that was a cold case sergeant and a missing person sergeant and had over a decade of experience within the homicide unit on hot teams. So we just were always appreciative of your knowledge and your support moving into this, and that has kind of built this relationship.
And the what I realized early on, the relationship was based on a symbiotic relationship. And what I mean by that is you brought advocacy to the table and was able to kind of bridge a gap that otherwise wasn't as strong as it possibly could have been between surviving families and victims of homicides that are unsolved. And I think it really became evident for me when we went to another meeting. And usually what happens is when we're meeting with some outside entity, not always, but sometimes when we were meeting with outside entities, we put on our armor because we were afraid we're going to be under attack of bad police. You're not solving my case. You don't care about our loved ones. You don't care what's happening. And that's not the case at all. We really do care. We really do want to solve these cases. These detectives take pride in the cases that are assigned to them. They take ownership of these cases and they want them solved. And you showed up at a meeting one time, and in that meeting, you spoke to some of these families that were on the attack of the detectives and said, "Hey, listen, you're angry at the wrong person in the room here. The person that you should be angry at is the person that killed your loved one, not the police who are working so hard." And I knew at that moment that we're in the right direction. And that was an advocacy and a, like I said, a symbiotic relationship that I knew I could benefit. And whenever I had somebody call and say, "Hey, listen, my loved one's case is not solved. It's been 15 years. You don't care." And in fact, I got that call the very first day I sat down in the seat as the sergeant in cold case. My very first day there, I got that phone call from a surviving family. And realizing that I had an advocate in my back pocket that I can call and say, "Well, hey, listen, we do care about your case. I'll take another look at it." And I did that many, many times, and we solved many of them as well. But in the meanwhile, while we take a look at your case, because it costs me nothing to pull it off the shelf and open it up and take a look at it. But in the meanwhile, let me let you talk to this gentleman named Ryan Backman. He's got a great organization. This organization is going to help you out. We're going to get some attention to your case that you otherwise haven't seen, whether it's through social media or otherwise. We have many avenues now. There weren't as many back then, but now there's plenty of avenues to spotlight a case. And so I knew right then that it was a good working relationship. And quite frankly, I was headed to creating an MOU of sorts.
Yeah, we did accomplish a lot, and I want to get into. Want to kind of talk a little more in detail about what we were able to accomplish and what we discovered worked well for both an outside entity and law enforcement, because there has always been a little bit of standoffishness, between law enforcement letting an outsider in. There's always a bit of hesitancy that a family will go public with information that isn't supposed to be public yet. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, but I want to real quick kind of give people an understanding of like how the process works. So I think, unless you've dealt with this, you don't understand, or you maybe don't think through the process of a homicide, a call out for a homicide unit, an investigation, when a case is cold, when it's stopped being worked, then what happens once it's inactive or suspended or cold, whatever the agency calls it. So let's talk through some of that. And I want to start with something really simple, because this was a question that I had early on. When my dad was killed, he called 911 himself. So he was shot, and during a robbery, he was able to call 911. He didn't really know where he was because he was working at a construction site that wasn't his normal day-to-day place, so he didn't know the address. He knew the road, but he couldn't really remember the suite number, the business address. But he calls 911. He gets the dispatcher, tells the dispatcher that he's been shot. So take it from there. What does that dispatcher do with that information?
So you're backing up all the way to the beginning here. So yeah, that's basically what happens. Is it starts out as a patrol case. When that 911 call comes in, patrol officers are dispatched to a scene. They get to the scene. They basically do an assessment of the scene, try to make a determination if a detective unit is going to be called out. Obviously, in this case, it's going to be a homicide call out. And what they do is they do scene establishment to make sure that the scene is safe, that's safe for citizens, for themselves, and that
rescue if that's needed.
Right. Evidence is being protected. Right, gathering any other assistance, securing an area, and making that phone call to homicide to respond, and basically that's the nuts and bolts of it from an onset point of view.
And that call that gets rerouted back through dispatch, so does the patrol, whoever's in charge of at the scene.
So generally, it's a sergeant that's going to be at the scene that'll have to make that call. Officers don't make that call. They call a sergeant, and the sergeant responds to the scene. He does that assessment, and he makes the call back to an investigative dispatch, and they in turn call the on-call homicide team sergeant, which in your dad's case was myself.
Yeah. So my dad was a Saturday afternoon.
It was.
So in the middle of your Saturday, you get a call.
Correct.
There's been a homicide, and you have to call your team and head to the scene, and then again, kind of that process of just establishing what is evidence, what to collect when the evidence technicians show up, interview any witnesses that may be around, that kind of stuff, right? I mean,
that's exactly right. And so, going back to your dad's case, there wasn't much there. There wasn't much in terms of witnesses. There wasn't much in terms of evidence. There was some work that had to be done. There were, quite a bit, and each scene is different within itself. There's scenes that you and I have discussed this in the past. There's been scenes that I've held for 3, 4, maybe 5 days at a time, because they're involved and there's tons of evidence, or what could potentially be evidence. And then there's scenes that you can clear out in a relatively short amount of time, within hours. And so each case is unique in its own regard. And that's hard for a lot of people to understand, because they just think that you respond out there, you put up the tape, you look for evidence, and you go away, and it's solved in 30 minutes, just like it is on TV. And it's nothing like that at all. And each case is so unique and differently, whether you have a person that's inside of a structure or outside of a structure, or, is there water involved? What's the climate of the day? Like we discussed, it was a nice day, but what happens if there's a torrential storm? We've worked them on Christmas morning. I've worked them in a hurricane. So I've had all the above, and each one has its own unique value.
Yeah. That does kind of segue into another thing I was wondering. Everybody's heard of or seen the TV shows like The First 48, and stuff like that. How do you as a detective or a sergeant prepare for what could be a couple of days of being awake? And is there truth in that, kind of like that if you've got to get so much done in those first 48 hours, otherwise the odds of solving it start to dissipate. What is your take on that as someone that was in the trenches that was doing that? And how did you prepare for sometimes, you woke up at whatever time you woke up that Saturday morning or any morning, and then you didn't always go to sleep that night, depending on what time the homicide happened, what kind of evidence was out there, whether you had witnesses to interview. I mean, all of that stuff comes into play. and you may be up for a few days.
That's correct. So I don't know that there's preparation for that per se. I mean, there is preparation becoming a homicide detective.
Coffee.
What's that?
Coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Coffee and patience.
Yeah.
So there is some truth to the cliche of the first 48, because as soon as you get to the scene, your evidence, you're working against time. One of our responsibilities though is, once we arrive at the scene, is sometimes it's chaotic. Not so much in your dad's case, but there are scenes where there's pandemonium, if you will, and we got to slow things down. We got to get control of the scene, slow it down, begin our investigation, and be methodical about it. But there are times where we're going days on end, where you have multiple victims and things like that. So from a personal standpoint, you have to have those conversations with your family and say, listen, I could get that call. It could be any time of the day of that 24-hour period that you're on call. And if you get that call, it could last 36 hours. Generally, if you start hitting that kind of time frame between 36 and 48, you're going to have to take a break, and when we have several teams in homicide, where if you needed a team to take over, or if you needed to lock the scene down so that everybody could get a few hours rest and then come back at it again, you could do that. And there's been times where we've had to lock it down because of inclement weather, or it was dark and we needed to do a better search in daylight. And so variable reasons, like I said, each one is unique, but yeah, it could last up to 48 hours, but those are crucial hours. Those are hours where you need to interview witnesses and look for video and lock in timelines, because timelines is what's going to help you solve your case, building a timeline.
Yeah. And, one thing I've learned since I've switched into, advocacy in this world of cold cases and dealt with my dad's own case, is that patience wasn't something that was necessarily a virtue of mine, prior to my dad's murder. And it's something I've had to learn, been forced to learn. But I'm curious, in an investigation, is that part of training, that like, this is a marathon? Like, the goal is not to get to the scene within 5 minutes and arrest the first person that looks guilty, within an hour, and be home for dinner and a shower. Like, is it, you prepare mentally that this is a marathon, that there's no need to rush anything, because that could come back and bite you later? Is that accurate?
If detectives handled it in the first way you said it, not the latter, rushed to the scene and did the best they could and as fast as they could, they would not be successful, and they would not last long as a homicide detective. That's plain and simple. Yeah, it takes a long time. And I've noticed even a paradigm shift over time. So since the year that I went into homicide, even before I was in homicide, I was in aggravated battery before I was in homicide, that working a crime scene from then to even today, 2020, has transitioned significantly. You've had DNA develop, and most recently genealogy and evidence, and how we collect them and how it's stored, and and what's collected and what is stored has changed over time. So there's been great advancement, great strides, and which lends itself to cold cases, by the way. And so when you talk about how do you handle a hot homicide, one that you're responding to the scene, yeah, you do have to take your time. You want to get there as quick as you can, but you're not going to, we don't run blue lights and siren to the scene. We're in an unmarked car, and we drive the speed limit, and we get to the scene in a expeditious manner, but there's no dragging your feet. And then once you get there, there's a detective that's assigned as a lead detective, and that detective basically kind of is the point man or woman to say, hey, listen, I need you to go interview this person and that person. I want you to check for video. And I'm kind of like the circus ringleader going, are we sure that we got this done, that done? Have I made notification upline? Have I made notification downline? And organizing the from 35,000 feet, if you will.
Yeah. That makes Makes sense. I want to get towards cold cases specifically, and I also want to again kind of remind people that each agency has its own policies and protocols and procedures. A lot of them are similar, but when Dan's talking about what he did, that's what he did at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. It's likely that any agency across the country has very similar, procedures, but maybe not. They may be a little bit different. So keep that in mind as we talk specifically, that it may not correlate with your loved one's investigation. But one last thing I want to hit on before we kind of move into cold cases is like witness cooperation and how damaging that is to a case when it doesn't exist. How frustrating that is to a detective if people aren't willing to cooperate. I mean, we all hear it all the time, the no snitch policy, and stuff like that. Give us a little insight as being a detective and, knowing, having someone, because I've experienced this myself. Literally a witness will tell you, well, I saw that person with that person 5 minutes before the shooting happened. And then you go talk to the person that they pointed out was there, and they just say, no, wasn't there. And I've had family members say, well, my neighbor came to me and said they saw this, and I told them to call police. And then they're having the survivor's having a meeting with police, and they're going, well, what about the tag number? What about this tag number that the neighbor called in? And the detective goes, what tag number are you talking about? No one has ever called me and given me a tag number in relation to your husband's murder. And this, so we know it happens. We know that people don't always come forward with information they had. If they did, we wouldn't have as cold cases, or certainly not as many.
Right.
So from your perspective, how much weight do you put in witness, interviews? And then do you get to a point where you kind of show up and you're like, well, let's not count on that because, we don't know what we're going to get when it comes to witness cooperation. So let's just focus on the physical evidence first, or, tell me about that a little bit.
Well, first off, I didn't do a whole lot of the interviewing of witnesses from a sergeant seat. So I'll tell you that. But of course, I saw firsthand cooperative witnesses and uncooperative witnesses. And obviously, there's a lot that's weighted in on, a witness testimony. It means a lot, especially an eyewitness. We have audio witnesses, eyewitnesses. Even when we're doing victimology, that kind of helps. Witnesses that tell us the normal patterns and behaviors of our victims. And that kind of helps develop, would we expect to see a reasonable action of this victim at this time, this location? Is this something that he or she would normally do? I've watched cases that I can remember a specific case. I won't get into the details of it, but we had a witness where we brought him in, and he was very uncooperative, didn't like the police. He had spoke to somebody else who came to us previously and said, hey, he saw the whole thing. He told me. He said that so-and-so did the murder. He hid the gun over there and blah, 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 blah. So we located the gun. All the information provided by the third party made sense. So when we bring him in, we said, hey, is there something you want to tell us? Nope, don't like you. You're the police and I don't like you. And by the way, a witness doesn't have to be a witness until the detectives come to you and say, we believe you have information. Now you can't hide it. Now you're kind of obligated. So, and basically we had individuals that were persons of interest. We had other individuals that were witnesses in the case, and we compiled some photographs of these individuals and basically showed them to them one by one and said, who's this? And who's this? And who's this? And one of those pictures was himself. And he didn't even look at him and just said, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And then when it got to his own picture, I don't know. And hold on, you don't recognize this guy right here? This guy is you, isn't it? So, no, I don't know. And so it was frustrating. Yeah. So you have those, and then you have those that give you all the information you could possibly, use, and that are star witnesses, if you will, and they run the gamut. You have it all different types, and some that are kind of half stepping in between, if you will, And so, I think the key to remember though is, for most of these families, is these individuals don't have to be a witness if they don't want to be a witness until we come to them. They're on the hook.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's transition a little bit into cold cases, but let's do that by talking about how a case becomes cold, how there is no real legal definition. Like, cold case is not a legal definition. It's not uniform across all law enforcement agencies. Some agencies have dedicated cold case units. Some agencies have major crimes units that work on cold cases. Some agencies don't have any of the above. I mean, we're going to be talking specifically about your experience and you and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, but keep in mind that doesn't always, relate to another agency. But I think from my experience and your experience that this is all similar. It's all similar, and the key is, when do you run out of leads? Like that seems to be kind of the big thing of like a case becoming suspended or inactive, and ultimately being cold. But that could be a different time.
Sure. So that's such a, there's no hard line on it. It kind of falls back into the, people want homicides and arrests to be so black and white, and that, if somebody did it, just go arrest them. It's simple, but it's not that simple. And when it comes to defining when a case is cold or when it's not, is really not that simple, because there's a lot of factors that come into play when we're talking about cold cases now. And so you're kind of waiting for the right avenue to open up, and we can get into the details. I know we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but what changes to allow us to look at a cold case. But backing up a step, generally speaking, the unwritten rule, and I hate to even put this out here, but generally nobody's going to suspend a case in the first year, at least at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. I know that when I worked there, that my superiors were like, no, we're not closing the book on a case until go re-canvass again, and then re-canvass a third time, and re-canvass a fourth time. Run through those phone records over and over again, tower dumps, just, keep fighting. Find a lead.
Find something else to look at.
Right. Do some interviews. We wouldn't let it go. And just to be tenacious about it and keep, running down that road of what can we do next? We would rely on other detectives. Have we missed something? Is there something that you see that we could do that would help us in this investigation? So generally speaking, within the first year, it's not going to be closed. Anyways, if you're closing one within the first year, you probably should be taking a second hard look at it. But again, that's not a written rule. So, but if you take your dad's case for an example, it went cold pretty fast, but we kept it open. And some detectives will hold cases open longer than others because they feel like they're on the verge of getting somewhere with it. And then now with DNA being on the scene, sometimes we get DNA hits, not necessarily the suspect, but we got a DNA standard that's at our scene that could possibly be a suspect, but we don't have a match. So a detective will keep it open, and not suspend the case or send it down to cold case while he's still working there. And also, generally speaking, if the detective is still working in the homicide unit at the time, even though the case may be suspended, if a lead develops on it, we'll just give it right back to the lead detective, because they're going to be the one most familiar with the case and knows all the ins and outs of it.
Yeah. And let's talk. And I know we've got some questions, and I was going to wait till the end, but one of them specifically kind of ties into what we're talking about. Like when the original detective retires, and it can be retires, transfers, promotes, leaves the agency, to go work somewhere else. What happens to that case? I know this answer, at least within JSO, but there's a lot of people that don't know, what happens. And again, this is a question specifically for the agency investigating your loved one's case.
Right.
But generally, and the experience that Dan had at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, when somebody left homicide, what happened to that case file?
If they're holding that case file, it's going to get reassigned to a new detective, and that new detective, his responsibility or her responsibility to sit in front of that case file and kind of get a grasp on it and know the ins and outs. Generally speaking, when somebody was leaving, it wasn't, when it came to homicide, I can't think of occasion right off the top of my head where somebody was here today, gone tomorrow, if you will. I mean, it could happen, obviously, but usually the detective was around long enough to say, hey, can you brief me on what the ins and outs of this particular case, because it's coming to my desk. And that's what we would do. Now, you also got to remember that, are we talking about a hot case? Because normally a who is holding a case in homicide is in JSO now I know other agencies that are smaller, it's completely different, but we're large. We have 1,700 plus cold cases in our agency. So a detective working in homicide is going to handle that a lot differently than a cold case detective at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. So if the cold case is, if it's a cold case and that detective retires, then it falls to the responsibility of one of the cold case detectives. Yeah. So if the surviving family wants to know information about it, they would call the cold case office, and the sergeant there would get a hold of one of his detectives to take a look at the case and make communications with the family. If it's an active case in homicide, then it's going to be passed on to another detective that's up in working active cases, and that would be the lead detective that the family would contact.
And usually that, like you said, with a hot case, there's a team of detectives. So in Jacksonville, there were 4 detectives and a sergeant.
Correct.
So there was the lead and the lead's partner,
Correct.
And then there was these other 2. So if the lead left, it would go to the partner who had basically not been the lead, but had worked every bit of that case along the line. You know what I mean? They were a part of that investigation all the way through it. And this was Sandra's question about, hopefully we answered it, that most policies would be yes, that case would then move to another detective if it's active. I think, for our purposes, let's say any case that is active where people are working on it, if an investigator were to leave, that case would be assigned to the next in line, hopefully somebody that had been working that case. And yes, their responsibility would be to review that case, to get caught up on that case. Now, keep in mind, we're talking about Jacksonville Sheriff's Office that had, 5 or 6 homicide teams of 4 and 1 sergeant. So if you have a small agency that only has a major crimes unit and they're responsible for aggravated assault, sexual assault, and homicide and any other major crimes in their jurisdiction, they may have 4 detectives total, maybe they may not have a team that has somebody that has been assigned to that case all along. The other thing I would add to that is, just basically I think what matters is whether the case, is active, whether it's gotten wheels, because it doesn't matter if it would be hot or in a cold case. If it was in cold case assigned to a detective and they were actively working on it and something happened to that detective, it would not just fall through the cracks. It would be, reassigned to somebody else that would continue, that movement. Now, if a case was not being investigated currently and was suspended and inactive, then there's no telling what, when the next time that case might get looked at again.
Well, I'll tell you this, whenever sitting in cold case as the cold case sergeant, whenever we opened a case for myriad of reasons, whether it's a family inquiry, whether there was a new lead or a tip, or there's a variety of reasons. Whenever we would open up a case, inevitably, at least when I was there, I could tell you without a doubt, one of my requirements was see if we can contact the original lead detective, whether they're retired, find out if they're alive even, because there's some that were deceased over time. We're talking about a cold case here. And get their insight, because a lot of times these lead detectives have these gut feelings or have this information that may not be suitable for a case file, because it's opinion, but those opinions matter to detectives because it might help formulate, because like I said before, things change over time. It might help you formulate an idea to look at something else. I think you're familiar with the case we had with the cab driver, and we ended up opening that case and looking at it decades later. And it turns out that when we called the lead detective, I did keep his clothing because I thought it was important at the time, but normally they didn't do that back then. And so when I heard that, it was, well, let's make a beeline to the property room in a 1972 case, and let's see if we still have the evidence. And sure enough, we did, which was nice because then we can take a look at the pockets for DNA and what have you.
And that's perfect. There's a question here from Karen that asked, my friend was murdered in 1973. Is evidence kept from that far back? What is necessary to reopen a case that is over 47 years old?
Well, evidence is kept from that far back if it's collected. The key is back then, a lot of times, some of that evidence just wasn't collected. You got to remember, in the 70s, there was no DNA. DNA wasn't even a thought, or a process. And so, at least in law enforcement, maybe in the medical world or science world, but not in law enforcement. So a lot of times back then it was blood typing. Is it type O or type B, type A? So I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say also along those lines was it may have been collected, but it may not have been collected with gloves. So touch DNA is something that they might be able to do now that maybe they couldn't do because it's the evidence technician or the detectives touch DNA all over the evidence that was collected.
Hey, it was the times. I remember distinctly sitting in the sergeant's seat at cold case and looking at black and white photos of 5 detectives standing around a decedent, one of them smoking a cigar in their long trench coats going, oh, okay, well, there's no standards here. But it was 1972, and it's just a different day and age compared to when it was. But listen, ask Bobby Farah about a 1973 case, and
I'm going to get to
right, 73 or 74.
74. Yeah, I'm going to get to that too, because I think that the people watching and listening will really appreciate how that unfolded when we're talking about, this one asked about how to reopen a case, and we'll talk a little bit. I'll save that a little bit for Bobby Farah is a great example of ways that family members can assist, and get a case looked at. But I wanted to, there was something else that I was going to talk about. Well, I guess back to Karen, what Dan said in 1973, maybe they collected the evidence in that case, and this is something that, has happened to every single law enforcement agency I've ever dealt with, and they never like to talk about it. But evidence gets lost, evidence gets accidentally destroyed, evidence gets caught in a natural disaster, in a flood, in a fire, and things like that. Dan, you can speak to it. It has happened in cases where, you knew that given the evidence that was listed in the case report, in the case file, if you still had that, there was a chance you could utilize new technology. And then you've gone to the property room and it's not there, and found out it was involved in a roof collapse or a flood or a fire.
Yeah, we had just that. We had a roof collapse in one of our evidence vaults, and it was bad storm that came through, tremendous amount of water on the roof. The roof gave way, damaged a lot of evidence, and it's an act of God. And it's an act of nature. What are you going to do? You're kind of handcuffed to working with what you have. That's not to say that your case still can't be solved, because there's many avenues. We solve cases all the time without, this part of the evidence or that part, and,
or without DNA.
Without DNA, right? So, Joseph Black was another case that we solved on a fingerprint, and Farah's was on a fingerprint as well, So, and that was the gold standard of the day. But I think it's not always the answer. It's not always the gold standard, Just because you have DNA at a scene doesn't mean that person did it.
Yeah, and Dan and I have spoken to a number of investigating agencies and groups, and, always try to promote, that cold case units digitize all their files so they can quickly search through them. Dan started that at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office with their cold case files. Itemize evidence, what you really have, and when the last time it was tested was, because the big thing right now is to to know that, oh yeah, we tested that for DNA in 1998. So DNA has come, the technology has come such a long way since 1998 that let's retest that. But you have to know those things, and really it needs to be accessible to you easily.
Well, the key here, I think, and the point that I like to drive home and that you've used as well over the years, is one of our responsibilities as a cold case homicide investigator is to bring cases up to current standards. So there's a lot of cases out there that haven't been brought up to today's current standards. Now, you've also got to look at the volume of the cases you have. You also have to look at, is the case historical at this point? And I think that kind of plays into Karen's comment. She said that's a case that's over 47 years old. I would probably open up a case that was 47 years old and take a look at, were there suspects in there? Or were there persons of interest? Were there suspects? If there was someone identified as a suspect, but not enough proof beyond a reasonable doubt to take him to court, how old was the suspect? Well, if the suspect was 68, 47 years ago, I'm probably not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on that when you have 1,700 other cold cases, so it kind of depends, because history does come into play when it comes to cold cases.
Yeah, we've seen that a lot with genetic genealogy. There's been a lot of suspects arrested, and there's been a lot of probably as many suspects identified that were already deceased. Because when you do start getting back, 40, 50 years, witnesses have passed on, suspects have passed on, witness memories, are that's all an issue, and makes it just exponentially harder. So, for Karen, we I truly believe there's a difference between hope and false hope, and that it's important to stay on that line of there's always hope, because Dan could tell the story of a Friday night when somebody just wandered into the police memorial building and confessed to whatever it was, 12-year-old cold case homicide. And that was not listed as a suspect in the case file. You know what I mean? So there's always hope that something like that happens.
I can't even begin to tell anyone. And that's a good example. And there's many more like that, where you just don't expect to happen what happens. And it happens all the time, where that one where the gentleman came in and confessed, his son was going down the wrong path and he saw it. And his thing was, I can't have my son doing what I did. And watch this, son. I'm going to show you how this works. And he did. He confessed, and we were able to prove it. And it was a game changer. And there's many, many more examples that are along those lines of cases, not that they're willing to come in and talk, but suddenly there's a change in a relationship and a witness comes forward who says, they've been divorced for all these years and now I can tell you. Or much worse, but maybe some resolve is, hey, now that the suspect's dead, I'll tell you everything that happened. We've had that happen before. So it just kind of depends on what it is. But there's so many variables and so many variables that come into play with cold cases to solving them.
Yeah. And that's on that side of hope. Those are the things that we don't have control over, but we have to keep, in the back of our head that any day, anything could break, anything could happen. But the flip side of that is, false reality. Like in a 1973 case, was that evidence collected? Was it stored properly? Is it lost? All of those things you need to know, so you know where to kind of gauge, your hope level at, and so keep those things in mind. And I want to talk, because you kind of mentioned it, and somebody asked about it. We said we'd get back to it. When you went into cold case, what was the criteria for looking at a case? How did you decide what cases to look at? And what were the things? Because it's not just one thing. Again, everybody wants there to be black and white, that you just have a magic Rolodex that says, hey, this case hasn't been looked at in 10 years. But that's not really the case. I mean, you have to have some kind of ability to, and I hate this word, especially in cold cases, but prioritize which ones to look at. Because if you do go down the path of looking at 50-year-old cases, that the evidence was lost somewhere and the suspect's dead, then you're taking away time from the case that has physical evidence that has never been tested.
Sure.
But how do you know how to do that?
It's funny you should say that. That kind of, I was on the front side of that situation, that problem. When I took over the cold case unit in the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, I came in there with open mind, open eyes, and ready to learn from detectives that had been there for quite some time and that were well experienced. And in the police memorial building, there's a area called a vault that stored, and you're familiar with it, you've seen it once before, that stored all the case files, and they were all in large, well, not all of them were, but many of them were in large 3-ring binders. Others were just in folded folders and boxed up in boxes upon boxes.
Bankers, boxes,
yeah, just a ton. And it was all hard copy. There was nothing that was digital when I took over that unit. And I remember a tip coming in on a specific case. It was a pretty involved case here in Jacksonville, and it made the news for quite some time. And when I said, well, can we go through the case file and see if this tip pans out or not, and just review the case file real quick? And the detective told me, he said, well, it won't be real quick, because there's several boxes, but I can pull them this afternoon. We can go through them first thing in the morning. I said, sounds great. We'll do that. This is probably day 3 of being in there, day 3 or day 4. So I come into work the next morning, and I think there was 10 boxes or more, 16 boxes. There was a lot of boxes sitting in our conference table in our office. I said, there's all the case file. And right then I knew that we had a situation where we needed to start taking all these cases and start scanning them in, get them digitized. That way we can do powerful searches using digital technology. And I made a case to my superiors to get a commercial grade scanner and hire an individual to come in here and start scanning them, which made it a lot easier for us to start vetting that kind of information. But so back to your original question, how do you prioritize that? When you have the volume of cases that we had, it wasn't as easy as let's just start right here and start going through them, because there was no right here. I mean, my idea was, let's go back. Let's play the numbers historically. Generally speaking, 50 years, now we're going to keep them forever. We had cases that dated back into the 30s, I believe. I think our oldest case was 31, if I can remember correctly. But what we did originally was, well, let's start historical. I think we went into the 1970 and started scanning from that point forward. And then we would go play catch up in the late 60s and what have you. But whenever somebody would call, if somebody called in a tip, or if somebody called in and wanted information on their case, if I ran into somebody and they said, hey, can you take a look at my loved one's case? We kept a running file, a digital running file of those cases that we did look at. So we did have that going for us. And I would pull it up and say, okay, well, we did take a look at this in 2004 or whatever year it was. And I would know that we had some information that I could pick up. Or I would look at it and go, we haven't touched this case in decades. Well, let's pull it and take a look at it. The one thing that I always try to impress upon the families whenever they called is to have patience with us. Even with the ferret case, I ran into him before Christmas, and he asked me to take a look at his dad's case. And I told him I would. I said, just give me some patience, and that I got to pull the case file. It's Christmas time. I'm working on half staff, and we'll get to it. Just give us a chance to go through it and look at it and get it assigned to a detective, have the detective review the case, because it's such an old case. Go to the property and see if the property still exists. What condition is it in, et cetera, and so on. Everything that we already talked about. So that's another way of prioritizing. And then when you and I kind of partnered up, you would get calls and you would say, hey, listen, here's some information I received from a family member. I don't know if there's anything to it or not. Would you be willing to take a look at it? And I would be able to tell you whether it was worthwhile or not based on many different factors.
And that was my first experience with lost evidence, or damaged evidence that was from that roof collapse. Was, somebody reached out to us. I reached out to you. It was a significantly older case from the 70s. You immediately looked into it and figured out right away that there was no evidence. There was no physical evidence left. But then also, with the Farah case, you just happened to be at a restaurant. You were acquainted with the victim's son,
right,
Bobby Farah. But you didn't, obviously he didn't know that you were in the cold case unit at that time. Y'all started a conversation. You told him that you were, and you didn't know that his dad had been murdered in 1974 and it had never been solved here in Jacksonville.
I had known Bobby for many years and had no idea that his dad had been murdered. And I don't remember, it was an anniversary of something. I don't know if it was his birthday or what the anniversary was. I don't think it was the date of death. I think that was in May, if I remember correctly. But he seemed a little downtrodden. He's like, yeah, I said, is everything okay? And he goes, nah, I'm just thinking about my dad. And I said, is your dad okay? You want me to pray for him? And he explained to me that he was murdered, and he asked if I would be willing to take a look at the case. And I told him, well, sure. It doesn't cost me anything to take it off the shelf and take a look at it. And when we did, the whole case just unraveled once we opened it up. It really worked out nicely. And even that brings up another thought, not to get too far off topic, but even then, this was a fingerprint case. And everybody says, well, why didn't they marry the fingerprint up with the suspect back then? Well, even with fingerprint technology, that has changed over decades significantly. Well, now they're reading the depths of fingerprints and, the points, and they're much more accurate than they were with the magnifying glass in the 60s. You know what I mean? So it's the example I like to use is, think of it in terms of TVs. What did a TV look like in 1970 and what does a TV look like today? And so as that technology changes, it changes across the board. But anyway,
I think sometimes, because we see TV and we hear all of the hoopla surrounding, DNA technology and genetic genealogy, that we forget that sometimes, re-interviewing witnesses, sometimes fingerprints, it's not necessarily, the case is never going to be resolved because there's no DNA evidence, and I think that, so sometimes it's shocking to people. Remember how many reporters reported that it was fingerprint DNA that solved the Farah case?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? They were so used to saying that it was DNA, that they just had to add that on to the fingerprint technology. Fingerprint DNA solved the case, and it wasn't DNA.
Right.
It was the print.
How about this? If again, you got to remember, as I described earlier, we have a vault the size of a room full of case files from the floor to the ceiling that circled around this entire room in the center row with rows of cases, and cases get misplaced. How about a time that we're sitting in an office looking for a case, and I said, I can't even find the case file. I don't know that, I don't have reports. It was a case from the 1970s. Can't find a written report on it. Microfiche, sometimes we get lucky on microfiche, sometimes we did not. That's, and talk about data technology, trying to go up there and pull that, and sometimes you have to do a negative, reverse it. And there I am one day, and we're getting ready to go to lunch. I open the drawer, and I said, it's not like I could just reach in there and pull out a case. And I pull it out. Sure enough, there's that case. It was misplaced. And, is unbelievable as it sounds, that's exactly how it happened. But it just goes to show you that it could be a simple mistake by somebody in 1970 who's placing it in a file and puts it behind the A or in front of the Z instead of in the wrong.
Or it's a case where somebody was missing and then they weren't found for years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And somebody either files it when they went missing or when they were found or identified. Sometimes they're found and they're not identified. And then it takes so there's all these things that come into play in an investigation. And I always encourage families you got to ask, and that's why we encourage families to develop at least a respectful relationship. You don't have to love the detective on your case. You don't have to really think that they're doing a great job. How about
this? How about if you feel like your detective's not doing a good enough job, have your detective reach out to our organization, your organization, and communicate via an advocate. And sometimes coming from the surviving families, it's abrasive or accusatory, and the detective is a little, standoffish, if you will. Not that they wouldn't be willing to help you out, but if it gets adversarial, then we all know how that ends up. Someone goes on the defense, and you get little done. But if you think, or even if you don't think it would be a good thing, do it anyways. Use Project Cold Case as an advocacy linkage between your loved one's case and your detective or the current detective, whether it's the original lead or not. And there were many times that I used you as a conduit because we were so busy and doing what we were doing. We had an internship program that was getting started. We had the digitizing of case files. We had our unit was also responsible for officer involved incidents. So we had a lot on our plates, and it was a beautiful thing to use Project Cold Case as a conduit to deliver information where I could be working in officer involved shooting and say, hey, let me get you with Project Cold Case, and he'll be able to help you and kind of give you some direction on what to expect next. And you are good at calming the surviving families down and saying, hey, we'll get you the information. You just have to learn some patience.
Yeah, exactly. Let's hit some of these questions. We've hit a couple of them, but and some of these, again, I don't know if we'll be able to answer, if Dan will be able to answer, as accurately, except from his own experience. But Patricia asked, is there a logical explanation for a sheriff refusing to work with other law enforcement agencies? And she named a Texas, a smaller agency not working with the Texas Rangers, another law enforcement agency. But, again, I don't know if you can specifically, in fact, I know you can't specifically speak to why that agency won't work with the Texas Rangers, but were you opposed to working with an outside agency?
Not at all. In fact, usually we kind of embraced it. I've got good friends that are homicide detectives all over the nation. Quite frankly, I've got a really good friend in Miami. I've got another one that's in California. I've got another one in Texas who's a ranger. That's very uncommon, and kind of lends me to believe that there might be more to the story. Is there a reason why the sheriff doesn't want to go there because he doesn't feel like there's any ties to that other agency or that other jurisdiction? Maybe they know there's no ties and they just can't release that information. So one thing we didn't talk about is a lot of confidentiality in these cases. We don't want to endanger a case by releasing information that could be crucial to a conviction on a case. And that's a whole other topic that you and I can talk about for a few hours. But the fact of the matter is this might be a situation where the sheriff knows that there's no ties to another jurisdiction. He's not going to go over there. He's not going to bother another sheriff or another agency because there is no gain in it, and it's a waste of time. Or maybe there is. There is a connection, and there's a reason why he doesn't want to. Generally speaking, I would say going both ways with agencies coming to us and us going to other agencies always have been well received. Just a phenomenal job. In fact, I pride myself on the fact that when they would come up here, we'd do a little extra for them whenever they came up here so that we make it worth their while to come up and help us, or we would help them. And it really works because you never know when you're going to need their help later on. And it helped for many, many years while I was there.
Yeah. Hopefully that was at least an answer. I mean, I think, it's hard for us to know specifically about that that agency and why they won't use the Rangers. Like Dan mentioned, we have a good friend that is a Ranger. And I know that a lot of rural agencies in Texas depend on the Rangers to come in and help them out, particularly with homicide investigations and the larger investigations. So it's really kind of odd that, one Texas agency wouldn't utilize, because the Texas Rangers are the state police in there. They have companies, company A, B, and C, and whatever that, are over certain areas. So they have the ability to come into that jurisdiction and help if they're asked to. So it does sound like there's more, information that we don't have that won't allow us to answer it specifically. But, and then there was another one I'm going to jump to, because it's similar in the fact that it's asking somebody else's opinion and asking somebody else to look in, but it's not law enforcement, which is in and of itself typically a problem. So Robert asked if there is a case that the victim's family believes has gone cold, what would be a good way to broach the subject of bringing in a third party to investigate, such as VDOC Society or the AISOCC, without hurting egos?
Well, this is not about egos. This is about, I can speak for Florida. So it's state law. It's one of those situations where the investigating agency holds the primary responsibility with a case. When you start releasing information on a case that's gone cold, then you start jeopardizing some of the integrity of the case. And what I mean by that is people start coming up with theories and they make up their own suspects, or they try to do. Sometimes are motivated by money and not by facts and truth. I can tell you from our standpoint, we don't use non-law enforcement agencies to investigate our cases. Have we reached out to other law enforcement agencies that are certified to help us on a case? Absolutely, happens all the time. But as far as a non-sworn agency in the state of Florida, no, we're protected by state law to keep these cases. And it falls somewhat under Florida Statute 119, governing in the sunshine. If a case is an unsolved case, and there may be some activity on it, we reserve that right to keep that case under lock and key, so to speak, so that we can build the best case possible. One thing I want the surviving families to remember is you have one shot at this in a court of law. And if for some reason you mess up this case by releasing too much information to the wrong people, and a defense is built, or there's many reasons why the case could go bad, you don't get a second chance in court. So you don't want to take any unnecessary risks by sending information out to third non-law enforcement parties.
And I know like VDOC and I think that other one too are typically made up of prior law enforcement. And so it's not uncommon for other agencies to present to those groups, but you have to remember that those groups don't have any jurisdiction. They can't make arrests. They can't issue warrants. They can't do anything like that. All they can really do is make suggestions back to the agency, of jurisdiction. And I know with VDOC, it has to be law enforcement has to willingly bring that case to them and present it. And then they just feed them ideas. And Dan and I both sat on a commission here in Florida. That was similar. It's the Florida Cold Case Advisory Commission. And we would both participate in quarterly meetings where cold cases would be presented to the group, and the group by the investigating agency, and the group would offer suggestions through their experience. Yeah,
but what's unique about them, and this is what I would recommend to Robert and maybe some of these other families, is the Cold Case Advisory Commission is just that. It was a commission. It was sworn officers, representatives from FDLE. Of course, you represented it from the advocacy standpoint. But so this is a commission, and maybe you should see about a state commission, whether one exists or whether one can be created within your state, to have this commission, and basically the commission was, I can't remember, maybe 50 people roughly, something like that, 30 to 50.
25 showed up to any,
Right. And then what you would have is you'd have all those sets of eyes looking at your case saying, well, did you try this? Did you try that? I didn't think of this. How about this angle? How about that angle? And that's something that can happen, but it's got to be a commission. It's got to be a sworn, a commission of sworn detectives and people that will fall under Florida Statute 119.
Yeah. And I think, forget egos. I mean, quite honestly, when we're talking about families that have murder victims and detectives that are doing their job, like, it really isn't about ego at that point. There's nothing wrong with asking, asking the detective, asking the agency, are you opposed to presenting this case to a commission, to a task force, to FIDOC, to VDOC, to whoever? You can always ask. I wouldn't worry too much about bruising egos. I remember asking the lead detective on my dad's case if he would be offended if I hired a private investigator. And he said, no, I won't be offended at all. He said, but just remember that a private investigator can do things that I can't do. And if the investigator does those things, that evidence or that information will not be allowed in court. And so if that investigator goes and, pulls a gun out of somebody's unlocked car and tests it, and it's the weapon that was used in your dad's case, we'll never be able to bring that weapon into the trial, because of the way it was found. So you got, and I ended up not hiring a private investigator because I didn't want to go down that road,
And I would submit to you, if there's any egos, the egos are actually in the other direction. By my experiences, they have egos as detectives, being the best detective, that I can solve more cases than you, and I'm better at solving cases than you. It was a positive ego. It's an ego that moved cases in the right direction. So, and again, in our agency, there was a lead detective, and that was that detective's case. And it's that way today, to the best of my knowledge. And it's only been 3 months. So, and I know it's still that way today for a fact. But so that the lead detective takes ownership, and they want to solve these cases. I promise you that. I promise you they want to get them solved. So the ego's in the other direction. And if they could get some help from somebody that would resolve in solving the case, they would do it. So
now kind of a third leg of that help, television shows. So the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office is notorious for saying no. Like, they just will not participate in any kind of show that's on, investigation discovery or, whatever. They have done a few in the past, but typically, whether it's, as somebody asked about Cold Justice and Kelly Sigler, like, they just say no. And I've talked specifically to the sheriff about it. It just, nobody can really say why. It's just kind of been the way they want to do things. But other agencies do use those options. So, and I mean, I don't know if you want to add to that, but I mean,
I do. When it comes to, think about this for a second. When it comes to some of these programs, it's not always the victim's best interest that they're looking out for. They're looking out for TV ratings, and they'll twist the truth sometimes to make it a better story. I've seen that happen. I've seen too many surviving families fall victim a second time to a TV show. So what's kind of unique, and the thing that we've done at Project Cold Case, which I really pride ourselves on, is being able to create a relationship with media outlets to do spotlights. And in fact, I don't know if you made the announcement, but we got something on the horizon that's going to be involving spotlighting cases throughout the nation, not just in Jacksonville. And so, and when it comes to something like that, we get to dictate the narrative. We get to say the things that we need to say to the media to help tickle the atmosphere and getting people to remember what happened on a case without endangering the case. And I was very careful to make sure that didn't happen. I know that we talked a lot about cases, And sometimes when they're older, you're at more liberty to let some of that information go. So,
yeah. And I think, again, each TV show is unique, and you have to look at it like that. We had a survivor family of ours that was absolutely destroyed by The Killing Fields, the show. They did a horrible job of portraying the victim and literally falsified the timeline and created scenarios to sensationalize and to keep people tuning in that were false and that had been false all along, that had already been investigated, but just to keep the show going. And it was a disaster for the family. But with that saying, knowing that, I also know families, one of them was on here earlier that did utilize cold justice in St. Johns County, just south of us, and loved them. In fact, I texted with Kelly Sigler today. She's a prior prosecutor. That's a show that I would get behind and say, cold justice is one of the ones that they truly are coming from the place of assisting law enforcement. Again, we're talking about sworn individuals that have a vast knowledge and resources, and so they're offering that to agencies.
Yeah, but also, sometimes, if you recall, a lot of times these TV shows, they want you to sign a contract, and in these contracts, there's all kinds of loopholes, and what they kind of try to dictate what they can and cannot do with the information on the case, and they want to hold your feet to the fire on some of these contracts, and a lot of the times. Or all the time, we send the contracts through our legal department to have them go through them and see if they're, valid, as something that we can stand on or not, So that comes into play as well.
Yeah. Y'all don't get distraught by Dan. He's from JSO, where they're taught not to not to participate in those shows. But you have to be very, very careful which shows and what you do. Yeah. And so don't just go out there and the first show that offers to do something, jump on it. And don't really hold it against law enforcement when they're, standoffish about that kind of stuff, because they've been burned and we've seen family get burned. I get calls and emails from production companies regularly. And, my pitch to them now is, don't even talk to me, because I don't trust what you guys do with these families. Basically what Dan said. I don't know you. You're trying to create a show. And quite honestly, I don't trust somebody I don't know in a show that I've never seen. So remember that. And then let's do a quick, because we've gone over quite a bit here, or 20 minutes. But Derek asked, in cold cases with a felony arrest warrant for a known suspect, do the cold case departments still handle those versus the U.S. Marshals task forces? I think the answer to that is go ahead. No, I think the answer to that is it's still your investigation. The U.S. Marshals go and actually physically arrest the suspect if they have fled the area.
Yeah, they're not necessarily an investigating agency. They're kind of more of a, I don't want to be crucified for saying this, but they're more of a support agency. And by the way, we've used them countless amount of times, and they do amazing work. I can tell you this, that I used to love it, because I'd say whenever we knew one of our suspects flew jurisdiction or out of the state, I could say we would meet with the marshal, sit down with them, give them a packet on our suspect to say, hey, this is who it is. This is all we know. Phone numbers, associates, relatives, and okay, thanks. And 36 hours later, hey, we got your guy. We're over here in Missouri. We'll bring him over there. Like, what? And how did you? And,
They are an integral part of any investigation where the suspect is known and has fled.
Yes, yes. They do a really good work. Yeah,
but that's their role.
Right.
I think it's important to remember that a lot of these agencies and departments have a specific role, and the more you can keep them focused on their role, the more well it works as a whole. So there is a innocence project for wrongly convicted people, but why can't something be started to work on cold cases? That was Sue asked that question. And I think there's a lot more cold cases than wrongfully convicted individuals is one answer. I mean, we have over 250,000 known unsolved murders dating back to 1980. It's more than that, now. Again, those are known murders. Those aren't the unidentified remains and missing people that have not been found that are murder victims. Those aren't included in that number. So I think that, and it's a lot easier. Again, think about what the Innocence Project does. They take cases where there is DNA evidence and they compare that DNA to the person that was arrested. So cold cases, there is not a person to compare DNA to in a lot of these cases, which is why they remain cold. But I would also tell you, I think that there are pushes, not necessarily on a national level, but on local levels, Project Cold Case, raising awareness for cases, assisting how we can. The Cold Case Advisory Commission, some states have a cold case task force, and they are working on, a larger grouping of cases than just the ones in one jurisdiction. But again, remember, depending on the jurisdiction, Dan, the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office has 1,700 unsolved murders dating back to the 70s. Clay County, which is our neighboring county, has 4. So, you can see just with that comparison of neighboring counties that it's going to be more difficult for an agency the size of Jacksonville to address all 1,700. Whereas in Clay County, it's pretty easy to bring those 4 up to the current investigative standards, at least, even if you can't solve them. So that's our big push, is to bring all cases up to current standards. That should be the realistic expectation for any family when you reach out to law enforcement and ask them to take a look at your case. And again, don't be scared to ask. No is still an answer. But, at least then you have an answer. But if you ask them, can you take a look at my loved one's case and let me know when the last time it was brought up to current investigative standards?
Or let us ask.
What's that?
Or let us ask.
Yeah, or let us ask. The Project Cold Case asks. So remember that, because that should be the goal. It's not always, some of these cases are not going to be solved with today's technology. Some cases are not going to be solved, unfortunately. But all cases should be at least, regularly, as technology changes and improves, brought back up to that level. So Casey said, what should we do if we feel like our agent has given up and is not taking our phone calls and told us, quote, he's done all he can do? That sounds horrible. I can't, it's frustrating that somebody would say, I've done all I can do without talking to you. But I would take that at face value, that specific detective has done all he's either can do or going to do. And I would wait for something new, whether it's technology, because basically what he's saying in a very, kind of rude way is that I've brought it up to current investigative standards and there's nothing else I can do with it.
Well, and I from a former sergeant's position, I have several questions that would coincide with that. I know at our agency that generally speaking, well, almost every time we would sit down with a family, as we did with you, Ryan, when we decided to suspend the case and that was going to be going down the cold case. We would sit down with the family and the surviving family and say, hey, listen, here's where we're at. We can give you a generalized synopsis of the case, kind of give you a briefing of what we've done and where we're at as far as evidence is concerned without getting into any of the details, and let you know that, hey, listen, we're as far as we can go with the case until something else breaks, until there's a change in relationship or a change in evidence, a change in witnesses or something, until something breaks, it's out of jail. There's technology. We're kind of out of gas. And cases do grow cold. That's just a fact of life.
And a change in detective. When I say wait it out, he's giving you the answer that is the answer, and I don't like the way he did it, but it's the answer, and it's not the answer that any of us want to hear. But he's saying I've got it to as far as I can take it. So unfortunately, this is where that patience comes in, and you have to wait for any of those things we just talked about to happen.
Well, where I was going with this was to say to you, who was it, Casey? Yeah, Casey. is just ask the detective, and I know it's not easy, but not in a non-adversarial manner. Would he or she be willing to sit down with you and kind of just give you what they can give you, which is not going to be everything. Understand that going in there, and give you a briefing of, where we stand on the case and what he thinks or she thinks needs to be done to move the case any further along, or what might have to happen. That might help you a little bit as far as the result, but if you have to kind of go in there with an open mind and an open heart.
Again, something that we could help with in our office. If you've, struggled with that relationship and you don't want to talk to him and he doesn't want to talk to you, maybe we can go in there and be that conduit and that bridge and get a simple answer that could be something like that. That as soon as so-and-so decides to talk, we can move forward. Or as soon as technology reaches this point, we can move forward. And I see Casey asked another question. And this is why it's really hard to get case specific, is because when we don't have all the information, because now the other question was, if the case has been sent to the FBI, is our local detective still supposed to be looking into it?
It still resides with the local detective. The FBI doesn't normally take over an investigation, especially when it's homicide. You got to remember, that's not the Bureau's responsibility to work homicides on a local level. They don't do that.
It's not their specialty either.
Right. And I don't say
that being try to be offensive. I mean, FBI is great and they do some amazing stuff, but homicide is typically out of their wheelhouse.
And we've used them in the past, and they'll be.
And what cases are those? Typically, like kidnappings,
right?
You know what I mean? Serial killers,
overstate jurisdictions, and
exactly, where there's a jurisdictional issue. Which I think somebody asked, what if the suspect fled the country? Again, that's where that FBI and dedicated roles. You know what I mean? So when Casey asks about the FBI getting involved, to me, that immediately says that there was some kind of jurisdictional issue where that case required, the FBI's assistance because, but then like Dan said, but that's still the local jurisdiction's case, again, with the assistance of another law enforcement agency.
Right.
So, this one, I think, will be a quick question. Jennifer asked, are traffic homicide cases included with cold cases that get reviewed by the cold case detectives? And
well, that's agency dependent also. And again, I'll speak to the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. We have a separate unit that handles traffic homicides. I believe in St. Johns County, one of our neighboring counties, it's all wrapped up in one, if I'm not mistaken. It just depends on the agency. So in our case, it's not.
I've never heard of JSO or anyone else referring to a cold case vehicular unit. I think I don't know if they don't consider those cases cold or how they handle that once they've reached that point. But I don't remember you ever talking about vehicular cases being in your in the vault or part of your responsibility.
Right. They have their own, we'll call it a mini vault, but they have their own vault. They do consider some of their cases cold cases, just like we would on a regular murder. But again, you're talking about a large city with a large agency, and I think they have 5 traffic homicide detectives and a sergeant over that unit. And they handle strictly traffic homicides, and that's just our agency. It varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Yeah. So this one was kind of a good question, interesting question. How often should the family call when we're talking decades-old cases? Every year, every few months? This is with us every day. That was Suzanne. And we actually talked about this the other day. Again, we have differing perspectives, but you were never offended by a call from a family, and particularly, when I brought it up to you, like I feel like every year there should be contact between a family and law enforcement, whether family initiates it or whether, some law enforcement agencies send out a letter every year that just kind of reiterates the case number and says, this is the number to call if you have any questions.
So prior to me leaving, I had already started the foundation of actually putting together something that did that automatically through one of our databases that we had built, that there was a checkbox there that whenever a detective was closing out a case or suspending a case, I should say, he would have a conversation with family. Do you want to be notified? And that same checkbox would be revisited annually, and there are, believe it or not, there are families that say, no, I don't want to be notified again.
It was a really great idea of an opt-in
system. It just was the timing of, there's a couple things that I kind of left on the table. When you retire, and things just don't, whether they're picked up or not, I don't know.
Oh, I know they're not. They weren't. But that was not your fault. But again, when you talk about patience and when things change, when one person takes over in a supervisory role or as a detective, it changes the game, and you really don't know what you're going to get. And so sometimes you have to, and I know this is exhausting for families, but sometimes you have to fight that battle again, that same battle. And I know it's exhausting, and that's why Project Cold Case is here to help with that.
Right. Straight to her question, I would say annually, once.
Yeah, annually for sure. And I, not just, for me, it's, did you get a new phone number? Do you have a new address? Because it is really important that agency have an ability to reach out to you should something break in a case, and should there, be movement. So even if you have to use that as the excuse to call up, you just say, hey, I want to make sure you have my up-to-date contact information and see if anything had changed. And again, as we talked about earlier, can you tell me the last time the evidence was tested? Is there any new technology out there? Have you considered genetic genealogy? Does my loved one's case fit, the criteria for genetic genealogy? Those are the kind of questions. And again, reach out to our office and we can help you formulate a list of questions to ask that show what you're talking about. It's factual, things that can help the investigation, or at least help get you answers. So reach out to us and we can help with that. Another question I saw was, I thought this was good. This was Diane. Considering the advances in technology, so many criminals getting added to CODIS every day, how often is DNA retested? And I think that's a misconception, that every time a new person is added to CODIS, that law enforcement has to retest the DNA that they've already submitted. But the reality is, once they submit that DNA profile to CODIS, it runs. And every time it's updated, it runs. So you don't have to retest it if it's already been input in CODIS. Correct.
Yeah, it's constantly checking it.
It's constantly checking it. And I mean, and there's different, I think, and I can't remember what it is, but like at the local level, it gets uploaded to the state level every day. And then at the state level, it gets uploaded to the national level every week or something like that. So it's not necessarily that it's being uploaded daily, but it's being uploaded quickly. And the old DNA does not have to be rerun through CODIS.
Here's a good perspective. So one of the new technologies right before I left that came online is a thing called rapid DNA. Whenever an individual was arrested on a felony, they could take their DNA and submit it to rapid DNA. And though if it got a hit, it wasn't a good enough hit to make an arrest on, but it was enough information to send it to a detective for him to follow up on that hit to see if it's actually a valid hit. And, it has to be validated. But that DNA is checked right there and then. That's why it's called rapid DNA. So it's being tested nonstop. Checked nonstop, I should say.
One last thing, and we'll end it. And I don't even know if we should get into this, but case files, and families always want to have access, and that's goes back to the integrity of the case. And if you release the case and and to the family case file, and the family reads it, and they tell their best friend what they read in the case file, and then somehow it gets back to law enforcement that this information that nobody really should have, and somebody's talking about this stuff, and they're not connected to the case. They're not the suspect, but they're talking about the case. That's the kind of stuff that can jeopardize the integrity of a case. And the other part of that is that public records laws are literally different in every single state.
Right.
And then beyond being different in every single state, the interpretation of some of those laws are different for each agency. So one agency may release certain information that another agency wouldn't. What you need to know is that an active investigation almost across the board, I don't know that for a fact, but across the country, is not eligible or is exempt from public records. So a lot of times it depends on how that case is, what that case status is called within the agency over whether that information is public or not.
Well, and my position on it, and you and I have had this conversation time and time again, that if it were left up to me, we wouldn't be releasing those cases. And the proof in the pudding is the Farrah case, or the most recently the Coaf case, or pick any case you want to pick. Joseph Black case. You don't want to release those cases. You just don't, because you don't know. You don't know that 1974 case is going to come up across your desk and you're going to solve it. And the last thing you need is that all that information out there flying free, for it to be misinterpreted and driven down a rabbit hole to ruin a case.
Yeah, and I would also just give this final thought and suggestion on the matter. If you develop a good relationship with the individuals involved in your loved one's investigation, you are going to get information that you wouldn't normally get. And that's just you develop a bond. When the investigator feels like they can trust you, they're more likely to tell you something that they wouldn't tell somebody that goes, running to the media, all the time, or, that they don't know. And I know that, sometimes that's a tough ask, because there's a lot of heads that butt in this world, with families and law enforcement. But, really try your best, to keep a respectful relationship, and if you can, develop a good relationship. I keep seeing, I've seen Latasha, post a couple times about her interaction with her detective and how she listens to what the lead detective says and follows with what he says. And it's not worth the risk to get a little tidbit of information that could jeopardize, a conviction, a future conviction. So you just, but that being said, if you develop a relationship and a trust, you will get more information. I promise you will get more information with a positive relationship than you will with a negative relationship. Sure. And you may not need a public records request to get the information that you're seeking. So,
in closing, let me ask you this, Ryan. Can you tell me a little bit more about Year of Hope for this year?
Yeah. I want to address Patricia real quick, because she said, I really thought this would be way more victim advocacy and less rah law enforcement. And I think that's kind of like, in a nutshell, why there needs to be a bridge, because there is this feeling that it's us versus them. And when I started Project Cold Case, the idea was we will do more together than we will do apart. So Dan and I don't always see eye to eye. He just mentioned the case file in public records, and he would never give that out. And I have a different opinion about that. We've talked about it a dozen times, 100 times, and we agree to disagree on that situation. But I always am respectful and listen to his opinion. and his perspective on why. And he always listens to my perspective and opinion on why. And we've changed each other's minds on things because we have that respectful relationship. And so I think that, while it is, unfortunate, and she left, she didn't want to hear that response. She said, peace out. But I really do think that that's important, that you will do better working together. And Dan and I know from working together, and we have also experienced the opposite with certain agencies and certain, situations. We know what works and what doesn't work. And you don't have to take our advice by any means at all. We're offering what we have experienced in life that has benefited me as a survivor that has an unsolved murder of over 11 years now. And you're getting it directly from somebody that spent 14 years in homicide and 28 years with law enforcement. So you can take that however you want, either as good advice or as bad advice. But that's what we're offering.
Yeah.
So, So Year of Hope, what we're doing, tonight and this whole month is we're celebrating that Project Cold Case has been in existence for 6 years now. Those relationships that we've built with law enforcement, we're hoping next week to have a former prosecutor come and talk to us about his role in investigations and, cold cases where the police know who did it, but there's not enough evidence. Why they can't run out and make an arrest, what that means, what it means if a case is jeopardized, and they can't prosecute. We'll talk about all that stuff. Throughout the month, we're going to be releasing some of the things we've been working on this year that nobody has seen. So stay tuned for that. And then culminating at the end of the month, we'll have a virtual event on Facebook Live where we'll talk about the state of the organization. We'll have a week-long online auction to raise money for Project Cold Case. And again,
I'm hearing rumblings of some pretty cool items that you're going to be having for.
Pretty cool items. This just came in today. If anybody that is a fan of NCIS, the TV show, and another agency that I know Jacksonville Sheriff's Office worked with on a number of occasions because we have military bases here in town, naval bases in town. But so that's a signed script from Flight Plan, episode 1710, 1712. There's your Mark Harmon signed NCIS hat. There's some other stuff in this box. A shirt that says Cast and Crew, a mask that says Cast and Crew. So looking at some hotel packages, some art, some autographed memorabilia from Sports Memorabilia. So join us. Check back on Project Cold Case Facebook page every day. We'll have some kind of new announcement, new video, and preview of something upcoming. And you can, if you have the means and you can donate through a Facebook fundraiser. And if you don't have the means, you can share our stories, share our victims' stories, and help out tremendously just in that way alone. And it doesn't cost you a dime. So,
yeah, and if you want, if you wish to be a reoccurring benefactor, just give us a call and we'll tell you what that looks like and how that happens. And we'll certainly support you in helping us out.
Absolutely. Dan, thank you so much for your time.
It's not a problem. Enjoy it. I'm looking forward to coming back.
Appreciate it. We'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody, for watching and participating.
All right. We'll see you.